All right, I have a YouTube open.
We're live.
Great.
I'm just making sure this is all set up. Hey, everybody.
How come it still says waiting for me on YouTube?
There we go. YouTube
Yeah,
is
yeah.
working.
Oh,
Thanks
sweet.
for...
Looks like we're live. Well, hi, folks.
Hey.
Hi.
Yeah, we just haven't done a live stream in a minute, so
Yeah,
thank you
always
for
takes us
everything. We usually have a tech
couple of
disaster
minutes.
when we do this.
Normally, you do sound kind of quiet. Maybe try to stay
where'd you go? You went away entirely.
Is
What?
that good?
There you
Yeah.
go.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, let's do that. All right, cool. So today we are joined by Katie MacBride. Katie is a journalist who writes about psychedelics, and we're going to be discussing her recent piece that recently came out in the Daily Beast, how psychedelic hype is hurting more people than we realize. So welcome, Katie.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I was really excited when you said you could come because we've all of us have been following your work covering the psychedelics field. A lot of several now very timely, impactful articles that have shifted the conversation. So it's just great to be able to chat with you directly.
Thank you, and it's my pleasure.
And just sort of get a sense for how it is that you approach projects like these. For example, how long have you been doing journalism?
Journalism since probably I think 2014 or 2015. I started just sort of writing about recovery. I'm a recovering alcoholic, and it was more out of like frustration with the way that conversation happens. And then it just sort of spiraled into like a lot of mental health and then more broadly health stuff.
That's great. It's interesting how psychedelics and recovery, are now things that people normally associate a little bit more often than perhaps in the past.
Yeah. There's the whole wild history of like Bill Wilson and LSD too, which I find endlessly fascinating.
Bill Wilson of AA.
I'm sorry, yes. Of Alcoholics Anonymous, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, took LSD. It greatly alleviated his depression. But AA also like basically gave him the boot for it.
Yeah.
So,
And from that early entry into journalism, what was your first? How did psychedelics come across your radar? First of all, how did that happen?
That's such a good question. I don't know if I can remember what the first piece was. I know that I was following the research that was coming out for a long time because I have a very specific interest in mental health, and it might have even been, I had my own experience trying ketamine for depression in sobriety. And for whatever reason, my system does not like ketamine, and I just threw up a lot and nothing happened. But I was involved. Well, I can't remember if I was involved in AA at the time, but like I was sort of in this place where I was kind of having a split with AA and how AA approached things. And it fascinated me that by some people in AA standard would have been considered a relapse, despite the fact that not only did I not like achieve any benefit from it, but like there was no psychoactive thing that happened whatsoever. So I think I started looking into it more on a personal level. And then as I did that, ran into some other issues that were more generally applicable to just what's happening in psychedelics.
I think it's interesting that, since we'll be talking about your piece eventually, which deals with psychedelic hype, a lot of the folks, that are the spokespeople for psychedelics as a revolutionary mental health treatment aren't always completely upfront about their own personal experiences or personal stories as to why it is that they you know are studying this thing in the first place. And yet, if you talk to them when they're not on the record, just like everybody else, most people who are interested in psychedelics are drawing from personal experience.
Yeah. Or even just experience, I think, running into dead ends with mental health treatment. And, I will get into it more when we talk about hype specifically, but I do feel like that is one stream of where this hype is coming from and it's the more sort of understandable and well-intentioned hype, where there's this faction of people that just desperately want there to be more options for mental health conditions where treatment's been stagnant for so long. And so I think, people always find their way to this subject for one reason or another that is at least somewhat relevant to psychedelics and mental health.
Yeah, you touch on that last bit in your piece about the hope for mental health alternatives and the pushback that you might get if you question the settled status of this great new hope in mental health psychedelic assisted therapy.
And
And I
maybe,
mean, go on.
sorry. If you have something else, go ahead. But I
No,
was gonna
that's
say
more or less my point.
maybe we could intro like the
Sounds good.
story just to have some context to like then talk about it. So, so we are just very curious to hear about what got you interested in writing a piece about the critical of the hype, the psychedelic hype, and what kind of process you had for what you wanted to cover, because it's such a big topic and there's so many pieces of financial and ideological conflicts of interest, and there's just so much there. So how did you navigate that topic?
So let's see, it's something I thought a lot about in the wake of my ketamine experience, not because it didn't work, but because I went through this period afterwards where, ketamine is framed as like, here's the thing you do when nothing else works, and it's the thing that's going to work. And so when it didn't for me, I was like, well, fuck. Like, so what? So this is just it now? I've reached the end of the road. And that probably made me start paying attention to the way the media has framed a lot of this stuff and continues to frame a lot of this stuff. Just having a ton of empathy and concern for people who don't have this miraculous experience with it, and what that must feel like, especially when the only messaging that you're getting is, this is going to fix you. This is going to fix you. This is going to fix you. Don't worry, all the problems are solved now. And just watching that hype spiral up and up. So I was already writing a piece about this when the off-duty pilot, it's funny, in Everett, just like 20 miles from me, was having some sort of prolonged negative reaction to psilocybin and tries to crash this plane, and is now facing 83 counts of attempted murder, which is bananas and heartbreaking, because he thought he was in a dream. And like, if you read his everything he was saying at the time, what his friends were saying, what the flight attendants were saying, like, it's very clear he was going in and out of reality. And when he was lucid enough to understand that what was happening was real, he was telling these flight attendants, you guys like have to restrain me. I've done something terrible. I've done something I would never do. And I don't know how you look at that and you understand that and you think, yeah, let's charge this guy with 83 counts of attempted murder. And then you have the New York Times being like, oh, it couldn't have been psilocybin because, oh, they were dropped. Oh, I really, that makes me so happy. I feel really horrible about it. But you have these experts in the Times being like, it couldn't have still been affecting him. It was out of his system. And it's like, okay, but that's not how we think about it when people have positive reactions. All of those go into the studies, even though the psilocybin is out of their system. So why is it different now when something bad happened?
Yeah. There's a lot that you've sort of put on the table there, but I wanted to acknowledge the cognitive dissonance of a person seeking, relief, whether it's in a clinical trial or in ketamine, which is readily available with a prescription, and that disconnect that you described. That's a lot, and I think that I don't know to what extent. I don't think anybody knows to what extent, as psychedelic therapy becomes scaled up, whether or not that's going to be a very common experience. At this point, it's very likely because I don't think anything can live up to the level of hype that we have seen.
It's just the reality of the numbers. There's been
Yeah.
incredibly few people who've gone through. There's been almost nobody that's gone through a clinical trial. And just to be clear on the case of Emerson, the pilot, he wasn't in a clinical trial either. He had taken mushrooms with friends around the fire, kind of on a whim.
Right. No, I didn't mean to imply that he was
No.
using it to treat his depression, but it was just a good example of people might not know that you can have a reaction that lasts for more than 24 hours or whatever.
Yeah.
I
just quickly, the charges, just to because everyone knows, so the DA wanted 83 counts of attempted murder, and then a grand jury indicted for reckless endangerment, which is a lesser charge, but it is definitely very serious.
Yeah.
I'm sure he'll get some kind of probationary period or something. That's my guess, is that there won't be.
One hopes.
I mean, it's quite clear. The second New York Times piece, I think the follow-up New York Times piece, when they actually interviewed him. Like for 3 hours, and he was completely transparent with the lawyers. I guess it was their legal strategy to be like, look, this is what happened. Let's throw everything out on the table. It's incredibly sad.
Yeah.
The story is terrible. When I was like feeling for him big time when I was listening.
Yeah, absolutely. Sasha says that even the reckless endangerment stuff was dropped, which would be great. But, it's still, he's probably never going to fly again. I think he's going to have, it's just, and it speaks to these larger issues. Like, again, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he had been dealing with depression for a long time. And when you're a pilot, you can't necessarily get help for that because they're going to take away your pilot's license.
Yeah.
At least for a period of time.
Right.
Either way, yeah.
And you see this happen all the time in medicine, with doctors and mental health. Like, we're so weird as a society about mental health and like who we allow to have mental health issues and when we support someone and when we don't. It just raises all kinds of thorny issues, I think, about our approach to this.
Yeah. No, and Sasha clarified, so the attempted murder charges
were dropped too. Okay.
Got it. My bad. Charges. So it's still there's restrictions. I think that the pilot's also not supposed to be like drinking or taking drugs. There's some kind of like, and not not on aircraft,
Right.
but still awaiting those charges
Yeah.
or those, on trial
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah, which,
I think one of the things that I thought was crazy about this case is that, there was another account from the Pacific Northwest with psilocybin where I believe it was a veteran at a music festival who thought it was the end of the world. He was on psilocybin at the time, but he shot 3 people, including his girlfriend. 2 of them died.
This is the thing that happened during the
Over the summer.
Psychedelic Science Conference,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It was
Around then.
yeah, it was at a music festival.
Oh, I did hear about that. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the Gorge Amphitheater.
I heard someone just talking about like why that didn't get more press and whether that was a reflection of just how numb people are to gun violence in this country, but already that was like a concerning incident.
Yeah. And I sometimes I go around and around in my head because like I feel like all these things spiral back on themselves, but like it just it's really striking that everyone seems to be okay with the lack of public education about these substances. And like, I talk about this a little bit in the article, like, yes, they can be helpful for a majority of people. They can, whatever. But like, you have to be able to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly, and to say, hey, listen, we're going to medicalize this. This is all based in science, and then to eliminate certain narratives or certain outcomes.
Yeah, we're just going to take
anti-scientific. I can't even wrap my brain around it, and it's like,
we're going to take out to fathom hell. We don't fathom hell.
Yeah,
we just soar angelic.
Explain that just in case anyone doesn't know the reference.
Yeah, go for it.
This is just the Huxley-Humphrey Osmond like going back and forth on figuring out a name for what you would describe the substances as.
The whole verse is to fathom hell or to soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic.
Yeah, what was Osmond's bad one? Phenaratime?
Actually, Osmond was the one.
Sorry, Huxley. Sorry,
yeah.
Huxley. I knew that. Promise.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And this is the imbalance of the official or like dominant narrative around psychedelics is so notable and is counter, I think, to the long-term aims of the field, as was so consistently articulated in your piece. And it just stands out to me too. So recently, the Johns Hopkins, there was a congressional briefing about psychedelics that researchers from Hopkins did. And one of the things that they stated there was almost reads as if it was like denying that people do even use psychedelics recreationally, which like, I'm curious can I read this quote to you all? Because I'm curious.
Yeah, no, it's great.
So it's, this is a quote by a researcher at Hopkins. I think I'm not sure if they're at the center. Like I think they're more in policy, but they say marijuana has broad medical and recreational applications. Psychedelics are primarily used for specific medical treatments under really controlled healthcare settings.
They're not.
It's factually
listen, where administration requires professionals to be around and help the patients receive their therapy. Marijuana really took a dual pathway towards commercialization, both the medical form and the eventual promise of recreational legalization. This led to really broad commercialization and really wide market penetration across the country. Psychedelics are likely to be more integrated directly with the healthcare system, akin to pharmaceutical models or in-person care models focused on therapeutic efficacy rather than wide-ranging market penetration. But I just don't see how you can act like this is just going to stay in a pharmaceutical context. Like that doesn't really make sense to me.
Or that it has up until now. Like
no, exactly.
What are you talking? Like tell that to anyone I went to high school with. You know what I mean? Like that's just not.
There's been something like under 2,000 people, 1,500 people. MAPS in their phase 3 have I think 100 people or so in both
I just
in
checked.
both
It's
in map
100.
1 and map 2. It's about 100 people
It's
because I think it
100
was like
people
50-50 placebo in each
who
study.
received the treatment in
And I'm
those
not sure what the total
clinical trials.
psilocybin numbers are, but
I think it's
if I had
110, but
well, total people who have gone through clinical trials at some state, lump all those n equals 12s in and all that. When you put everybody into a box, it's something like under 2,000 if I had to ballpark it. There's
Yeah.
millions of people who use psychedelics a year.
right.
Millions. So saying that like this is how psychedelics are used, that's just propaganda. That's just like this indoctrination of medicalization is the way. This is how
Right.
these are used, and that's just part of this overall campaign to make psychedelics palatable to normies, to boomers,
Right.
to conservatives.
Right. The Michael
And
Pollan.
like I get it because like not even that long ago, what was like just a handful of years ago, for me, it was always like the Bill Hicks line, can we have a positive story about drugs? Because the media was never focused on any positive stories
Right.
about drugs.
Mhm.
And that had lasted for years and years and years. There was never, it was always the young person takes LSD and wants to fly.
Mhm.
And so we're living in this, we've been living now for whatever 50 years, more than that. It goes back into the early 1900s, prohibition, but like we've been living in this period of forever of like super oppressive drug policy. And so a lot of the folks who were in positions of power and forming narrative and all that, it was the pendulum swung in the complete opposite direction. And in the media, it became novel. It became an interesting, weird, novel thing for journalists in the media to pick up on. That it was like the complete opposite. Oh, you thought psychedelics were just this awful, horrible thing, but here's the opposite is true.
Right.
And that starts to get views, and it's this new interesting thing. But in that process, those like two binaries, like everything's fucking terrible, everything's wonderful. And I think what we're interested in is it's not either or of those.
Right.
There's a mature dialogue, there's a more interesting discourse that needs to be developed that is tempered.
Yeah.
Well,
And
yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm glad you raised the issue of the media, because I do think it's, part of this has so much to do with the issues we're seeing in journalism in terms of dwindling jobs, this push for SEO clickbait bullshit, just come up with a counter narrative that's either going to surprise people or piss people off. And that's what we want. Nuance. What's nuance? Like, people are too stupid for that, And so it gets reinforced in all these ways that just happen to be like really good for maps and like really good for...
I may have said this before, and I often draw parallels between narratives around psychedelics and narratives around sex. But in the wise words of Salt and Peppa, we need to talk about all the good things and the bad things that psychedelics may bring.
Yeah.
And this gets to something I was hoping to touch on or have kind of include in this conversation, which is our open letter to John Oliver's Last Week Tonight, because that was our attempt to kind of describe in a brief, succinct way a lot of the issues as we saw it related to the field, and specifically for people who did see value in psychedelics. There are still these issues with the research, with the incentives of money and power. And one thing that was quite common in terms of reactions from the psychedelic kind of community watching that John Oliver piece when it came out was, this would have made sense 5 years ago, like when it was still new and people were like riding on that kind of, this is a different thing and it's the unexpected, psychedelics might have benefit, but it doesn't make sense to cover
Right.
psychedelic. It was extremely disappointing. Just for anyone who doesn't know, like, we had been reached out to by producers at John Oliver's Last Week Tonight months before they ran their segment, and we ran through all of the nuance about that, that it's, things are not that simple. And then they ended up running a piece that was very much like the hype. It was like just the hype, and it was really not acknowledging any of that particular nuance. And we were really disappointed, because usually John Oliver is the type of that show tends to say the things that other news outlets aren't saying, critiquing power and moneyed interests, and how those things can create problems where you might not expect them to be. And so it was a hugely, just a disappointment, because we felt like this could be the opportunity to break some of the hype into the public discourse, and it was not. And so we just wanted to clarify, like, look, they actually knew all this. Like, we told them this ahead of time, and they still ran with this very oversimplified, hyped narrative.
And that's such a bummer. And I think there is this tendency in psychedelics. Like, I reported on this sexual abuse and everything that was happening at CCM, which you guys also covered in Cover Story. And the way people are so quick to say, that doesn't really count, that doesn't really matter, like, that's not really part of this. And it's like, why? Like, why is it not? And yeah, I don't know.
Because they don't want it. They don't want it to be. I mean, the reality is, it's like a huge part of the structure.
It
is the structure. It's the history. It goes back. It's all tied in together.
Yeah, and it just I feel like I say this all the time, but like, if you're, people say, oh, it hurts this movement, it hurts the movement, and it's like, if your movement is predicated on covering up sexual abuse, it is a bad movement. You need to deal with some things in your movement. Like,
it's real cringe to even say that. I don't know who can say that with a straight face. Any movement that has bad actors or shit that's going on, or con artists or frauds or predators, the objective is to remove them so the movement can move forward in a more positive, regulated, or whatever way. You get rid of the bad actors. You get rid of Sam Bankman-Fried because he's a con artist, and then you can therefore move forward. But yeah, I mean, people, there's tons of tribalism, you have all that. And so it's like arguing sports teams or something, they can't do any bad. So it's a very, that dialogue is just so basic.
Yeah, it's part of why I'm really interested in this field, is that there's so many overlapping factors that are contributing to the ways that the discourse kind of circulates. I mean, one of the things that comes up around this, and this was the sense I personally got from interacting with the producer, was that they didn't want to be responsible for like messing it up after like so much had gone into getting to the stage. Like, people don't want to risk, and especially when you're hearing the hype and you're hearing this could be saving, millions, billions of people, if not the planet itself. Like, who are you to get in the way of that? And so there's that kind of concern of like, well, I better kind of keep this to myself if there's anything untoward that's going on. But then there's also people who feel like, because of the suggestibility inherent in certain psychedelic experiences, that the idea that if you talk about the bad stuff, that will somehow make it occur by like, so there's like kind of like a woo spiritual, even like The Secret kind of mentality around it, where in some quarters where people will say like, don't focus on the negative, because that's like calling the negative in,
if you name the monster, it will appear.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's also go on. I mean, there's this, the thing is with psychedelics in as a therapeutic tool, they've kind of been able to smuggle in a lot of unexamined practices and ideals by saying this is totally different. This is a paradigm shift in mental health, and so you have to, suspend the normal, checks and balances on how clients are interacted with by clinicians, and it's really interesting how that is beginning to be examined a little bit more, because it doesn't hold up to its own its own story as as more people get a chance to look at it.
Yeah.
And one thing that comes up in your piece and is related to conversations I've been having a lot recently is the idea that, like, when harms do occur, they're often portrayed, well, as you say in your piece, like if someone like the airline pilot has a bad experience, it's, people are coming forward and saying, oh, that's just because that person had mental illness. It's not, it couldn't be the psilocybin. There's that aspect of it. And you mentioned in your piece that the benefits that people report after taking psychedelics are attributed often even by scientists to the psychedelic, whereas anything negative, oh, that's like some externality, that's some external factor caused that.
And also you're proposing to treat mental health conditions with it. So like, it's like, saying, that person had a mental health condition, as though that's not like a relevant data point.
Right.
When this is what you are proposing, we treat mental health conditions with. Like, I think
that was Eiko Fried that you were talking about, his paper that you were talking, him and a colleague, that the paper that they like pointed that out. The problem, I mean, you got to get the people who are like, I don't know. To me, like, some of the most obvious things in this field are just not obvious to the
people within it.
Yeah, they're just not. It's like some of them seem real basic, and yet it's sort of like heresy to say them, or it's you're a skunk. You're a skunk if you say them.
Right.
It's really bizarre.
Well, I think it's why we are here. This is where this current moment kind of has taken us, where you have a lot of energy from sort of true believers, cheerleaders, as I often refer to them. I'm a recovering psychedelic cheerleader myself. But then, when Rick Doblin has gotten to the point that he has, where he's in a white suit, in front of 10,000 people after a long time, decades of attempting to mainstream psychedelics. Well, he's the dog who caught the horse, or the dog who caught the car. And
yeah.
And so here we are, and people like Eiko Fried, who's a methodologist, as you helpfully point out in your piece. He's somebody who studies scientific methods, experimental design, takes a look at this, and it doesn't pass the most basic sniff test. And I do encourage people to follow the link that you put, because Eiko Fried's paper has this really helpful 10-point list in it that just really describes very clearly some of the basic flaws in all of the psychedelic research that is at the heart of this hype, which is not to say that some of the things that psychedelic researchers and advocates are saying aren't true. I mean, there's plenty of anecdotal advice, anecdotal accounts that psychedelics can be beneficial. I don't doubt those, but it's about the details, especially as you scale.
Yeah, and questioning the methodology of the research, or questioning, how MAPS is planning to apply some of this or whatever. Again, like, does not mean that you think people should be in prison for having or using psychedelics. Like, there's this thing that happens where people wrap up medicalization and criminalization like those are your options. We either criminalize it or we medicalize it, and it's like there is very much a wide space in between.
Yeah.
That like we don't have to be putting people in jail for this. We don't have to be perpetuating like drug war harms, but we still maybe shouldn't just encourage anyone with treatment-resistant depression to go find a shaman.
Right. Kayla in the chat actually pointed something out. If people don't follow, it says they had the wrong one, BPD. I think that would be bipolar disorder, but also, one of the other wrong ones would be like, I think you're probably referring to borderline personality disorder, which is stigmatized even among like psychedelic therapy circles. And it's the very succinct way in your piece that you point out, like that, Iko Fried's comments on, and what you've elaborated here about sort of the heads I win, tails you lose way of highlighting the long-term benefits, the permanent changes, the dramatic recoveries that extend long, months, years, even permanently after taking a single drug. But anything negative that happens actually like leverages mental health stigma. And this is one of the things that is inherent in some of the power dynamics that come from a medical lens for all of this, is that people who have trouble or are abused by mental health providers are always fighting an uphill battle. There's a power imbalance where you've already been labeled deficient, defective, unreliable, erratic. It's just sad.
It is, and it's so it's just so unnecessary. Like to move this issue forward in a responsible way, like two things can be true. You can be doing this research, you can do all this stuff, and you can talk about when it doesn't work or when people are like, it's so unnecessary to try to shoehorn everything into this like shiny, it's going to fix everything. Oh, actually, what do we need to solve? Like, the war in Gaza, like we just need Israelis and Palestinians to like take a bunch of MDMA together. And it's like, how offensive. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not a Middle East expert by any means, but even I know that is very offensive. Like,
Yeah.
to just deny decades and decades and decades of history and be like, just take a little MDMA, it'll be all good.
I appreciated you included that as an example in your piece. I had commented on it as a commentary on the hype surrounding psychedelics making you more progressive in a piece called Lucy in the Sky with Nazis like 3 years ago. And seeing, there's a recent Vice piece that came out and dug into that same stuff as some kind of reply to the speechlessness inducing horror that is unfolding in that in that region. There, it is exactly a perfect example of the kind of hype that is some kind of bedtime story for adults. The mental health system that we've got sucks. It just it punishes people. It doesn't solve their real problems. It stigmatizes them. There's not an easy solution.
Right.
And I mean, to me, this topic I think is it's something I'm certainly going to be watching in the months ahead, because there was a Lucid News article that was emphasizing how, because of course, like October 7th, there was essentially like psychedelic festival that was
Nova. So it was a Psytrance festival.
Yeah, and so that was attacked by Hamas, and so it was an article about how the psychedelic community in Israel had kind of like rose to the occasion and was helping to, provide mental health services for people who had survived that festival. And there were people, advocating this piece of trying to expand these services out to the families of hostages, and also a kind of implication that, they wanted to extend psychedelic assisted therapy to these groups. And what struck me about that piece was that there was no mention of the Palestinians at all. Really, there was Hamas, but the situation in the context of ongoing bombardment, that wasn't acknowledged. And to me, there's a parallel between the ways that the ideology of especially far-right Zionism and the ways that dehumanizes Palestinians that you see. I mean, I watched a piece earlier today about how people are going, IDF soldiers are going and streaming, filming the humiliation and contempt and burning of food supplies for a population where 9 out of 10 people, this video said, weren't even able to eat every day. That doesn't happen without the underlying ideology of dehumanization that is driving these actions. And to say that empathy, that all you need is empathy, when you're not willing to interrogate the systems of power that perpetuated this ideology and entraps people, convinces people that this is a logical way of viewing fellow people. That, I mean, there's a parallel there between what's going on with aspects of the psychedelics field, because I've been speaking to people who have been harmed in psychedelics contexts, and we've been discussing, a lot of people here, we need to return to these events that have happened in these big publicized 1980s MDMA abuse, the situation that happened in the MAPS trial, the situation you covered with Center for Consciousness Medicine. And we're not saying we need to return to them because we are social justice warriors intent on throwing stones. No, it's because there are ideologies circulating in mainstream aspects of the field that are incentivizing, encouraging, rewarding, protecting bad behavior like this. And those ideologies are going to continue hurting people if we don't interrogate them. And no amount of empathy on its own is going to be able to deconstruct this kind of groupthink about what psychedelics are and how healing works. And one thing, just to end, my point here, one of these examples that I've been talking to people about is something that Brian Pace touched on, in terms of the exceptionalism that attends the way that people think about psychedelics and healing. There's so many people right now who are saying, we need to do right by this field, we have to have an emphasis on indigenous reciprocity that extends beyond material reciprocity, like money, to incorporate the ontological commitments and views of indigenous groups. But this provides, because it's engaged with superficially, it provides a cover for people to say, this might look like abuse, but actually it's non-dual. This might look like abuse, but actually it's from an indigenous tradition. And people feel like they need to just go along with that because they don't want to be the one to say indigenous views aren't welcome here. And so without interrogating this more closely, there was even another Jules Evans on Twitter the other day. So there's another example of someone who had abused people and said, oh, this is just a alternative healing modality with sexual assault. So, I mean, this is the issue, that if without it's not just a matter of we want to punish people. No, we have not learned the lesson of these harms in a way that's going to make people safer. And sorry, last sub point to all of this is just that people often make this out to be an issue of bad actors. We just have to identify and remove the bad actors, not acknowledging the ways that those are incentivized. These bad actions are incentivized to appear, but it avoids looking at the ways that the ideas are are encouraging these outcomes, and that the doctors, especially, like, people will say, well, we can't, abuse happens everywhere, so you just want to shut down the field because abuse happened a few places.
Right.
No, we can make this field safer. We can make the
Right.
field better, more fun, more
Right.
healing. And that's
Right.
that's the work ahead.
Yeah. And, you know, it's so mind-boggling to me to have this subset of people writing off individuals who have been harmed or deeply traumatized or have some extreme mental health reaction to it, like, to say, okay, like, none of that, like, really matters. And also, we are the people in charge of providing the next generation of mental health treatment, and we know how it should go. It's like, like, how are we entrusting people who will not look at harm to the people that they are supposedly out to help? Like, I'm not saying that in a very articulate way, but, like, am I making sense?
You're
Like,
making a lot of sense, and it's something that, I think was one of the things that started to shake me out of sort of blind optimism about this field. I very much believed, that this was an entirely principled sort of crusade using the best science and technology, and even fighting our squeamish prudishness about drugs to heal trauma, to support people who had been, really mistreated and left behind, and then to see the way that these multiple examples throughout, the history, the antidote to this kind of exuberance is really a good trip through memory lane, reading our history, and very much for the same reasons that Nishay was mentioning just a moment ago. These are important lessons to learn from, once again, particularly as all of this is going mainstream, whether it's medicalized or whether it's just broadly decriminalized in every blue state and blue city and in a red state. I'd be saying the same thing. I'd be saying we need broad scale education, general education for the public, education that comes from learning and reckoning with these. I don't want to minimize it by calling it like a misadventure, like a
I mean,
failures.
This is a misadventure, though. The reality is that prohibition is this just wet blanket that allows Stan Groff's ideas to grow and then be laundered through they're laundered through maps, and Rick Doblin has threaded the needle of these fucking bizarre pseudoscientific therapeutic practices from Stan Groff. If you were to get rid of this prohibition, you have more voices that are at the table. You let in more people into the room to have conversations. You dilute that crazy that is actually the dominant narrative in psychedelia right now.
Yeah, and it's one of the harms of prohibition, which is this marginalization, which brought fringe ideas to the forefront of a drug that induces suggestibility. I cut you off there, Norby. You finish your point.
I mean, I guess I was getting at, like, medicalization is depoliticizing. That's one of the main things that it does. Yeah, you can argue. I think you can definitely argue that through medicalization that it has motivated decriminalization efforts. I think it'd be dishonest to say it hasn't. But they're very at odds with one another. One's political, one is not. It is. Medicalization is obviously political, but it's
status quo political.
Yeah, it's not like depoliticizing, They're not looking for like actual, real, deep cuts to the drug war. They're looking to carve off a slice so they can occupy that slice.
Right, so they can profit from it.
Yeah. And so they can get their ideas through whatever, their weird new age medicalization, Stan Groff, Roquette techniques. These are very strange beliefs that a lot of these people who have been kind of instrumental to pushing this space forward over the decades. It's like only the weirdest of the weird have carried it forward, kind of. Yeah, and so when you look at MAPS, it's just very strange pseudo-scientific beliefs packaged into some nice. I had a friend, who said like MAPS is. This is a bunch of years ago. He said this, but MAPS is like really succeeded in like capturing the aesthetics of psychedelia.
Yeah.
And they continue to.
Yeah.
I think they continue to, but they're losing it. I mean, anyone who signs up to the email list is just like a steady stream of cringe. It's crazy at this point.
It's bananas.
Crazy. It is bananas at this point. The emails that they send out.
Like,
it's
leave
like
your
almost
estate to us, and
unrecognizable.
we'll help you plan your will. That's
yeah.
a
I love
normal
those.
thing to just like throw out there.
That's one
Well,
of the
one of the things that actually
fundraising tools.
One of the things that blew MAPS up back in, I don't know, around 2012, 2013, 2014, so Psymposia, which is actually going to be 10 years old in February, at that time, MAPS was really small. They were a really small organization. It was a handful of people. And they had a very small budget. But then a woman died, I want to say in 2012 or 13, and she it was a bequest, and she left MAPS $5 million, and that exploded their budget, and they were able to plan multiple years and make some hires and I think fund the phase 2 studies a little bit more at that time. But that was like one of the big pivotal moments in their transformation was someone giving them I think it was $5 million in a will, which I think now it's, people have such a religious conviction about this space. It just seems they have experience of getting money from wills, and now I think they just see that as a I don't know, an effective fundraising technique. You can donate to MAPS to support their for-profit corporation now that is controlled by venture capitalists. That's great.
It may actually be effective.
Incredible.
Is what's really disturbing. You know what I mean? Like,
I've been told by some people who know what they're talking about that they're kind of, they don't have they're in big trouble. The PBC. They're not well. The business plan's terrible. The finances are terrible. The reality is, even if they cross the finish line, which they probably will, and they just announced it.
Mm-hmm.
What might be towards the end of next year. Let's say it's the end of next year, or 25. The amount of money that they need for commercializing MDMA, and a huge part of this building out the actual physical infrastructure to support psychedelic clinics and all that is gargantuan.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have IP. They don't have moats around them.
Right.
And so that process is going to be quite difficult. So we'll see what happens. I don't think we've seen like kind of the collapse of corporadelia at this point. Whether or not that returns if markets and macro conditions change, we'll see. But I don't think we've seen the flush out yet. But
it's going to be really ironic if, when the dust settles, what remains are some of the decriminalized cities in this country, because I've been around the psychedelics movement long enough to have the plan described to me. Hey, we get it through FDA, we get Alaska, Arkansas in one fell swoop without a single vote.
And
we're not there yet.
Wonderful, and you still don't have any federal protections.
Right.
So
I've heard people, I don't know how true this is, but I've heard people talk about how a lot of companies that have less of a psychedelic evangelical kind of conviction about, we're here to do this work right now because we're evolving consciousness to get to the next phase of like human evolution. The people who are like just pharma people are kind of all in on MAPS succeeding because the hope is that they will be able to lay down the track of the infrastructure, which could take the entire exclusivity window that they have to actually just like set up the stuff that the other companies then won't have to pay for. So right now we're kind of like, even though there's so much concerning about to underplay how concerning some of the stuff is, concerning stuff coming from MAPS, especially Rick Doblin, very counter to what we know about abuse and trauma and all the rest. But people are kind of like they don't want to mess up that golden goose egg that like they're committed to this working out. And so that's one thing that I think is contributing to people not talking openly about some of the concerning things around MAPS, at least.
Yeah, at this point, Rick as a conductor is the psychedelic train. Rick has been the conductor. Rick has been thrown off the train at this point. He's not the conductor anymore. He's been within MAPS. Rick has lost almost all his power at this point. MAPS PBC, this is a longer story, but MAPS PBC has been taken over by investors in certain positions. That power is gone. And what was interesting, what's the name of the Treat California woman?
Jeannie Fontana, I think.
Yeah, it was interesting. She did an interview with the Microdose. I think it was in the Microdose, and casually dropped that Rick has been like the BBC has been taken over by VC. I was like,
and that hadn't been like,
that hasn't been announced anywhere.
Yeah, that had been
no one's
like
going to announce it.
But doesn't that say a lot? That
it's just like a casual drop that she made.
Yeah, that was like, the first Rick public acknowledgement that I saw.
And it's also similar though from when Rick stepped down as executive director. It was barely a blip.
Yeah, but that was just because of a updated Florida requirement of nonprofit filing that we were told.
Yeah, that Treat Microdose interview, that wasn't the only strange thing about it. There was also this like
the pivot to cold fusion.
Yeah. Because Treat was like, hey, let's get a constitutional amendment passed by the voters to like set up a research fund of $5 billion or something for psychedelics and establish an oversight committee. And of course, it didn't even pass the their own polling, so they pulled the plug on it. And so as she's sort of doing the post-mortem really in the Microdose, she goes, yeah, anyway, so now we're gonna do fusion. And it's just like I thought it was sort of emblematic of some of the things that we were talking about earlier about just because of the marginalization of psychedelics for a long time that really hasn't been fully resolved. There's not institutional homes for psychedelics within universities or governmental institutions. Like they often find themselves bumping around with a lot of other people with ideas about building space elevators or colonizing Mars or whatever it is.
Right. And you think about how much money is in psychedelics right now, and not even necessarily MAPS, just like generally speaking, how much venture capital, how much everything is going into psychedelics, and our like total lack of investment in existing mental health structures for decades. And it's not to say the existing mental health structures are great and we should give them more money because they're doing such a bang up job. But I do think it's worth thinking about like how much, especially in the political arena, how much is this being pushed forward by, even some supposedly like bipartisan legislators because it's dealing with the existing mental health system is too hard and too costly and too whatever. So you're just kind of sticking all your eggs in the psychedelic basket.
This has come up in Kentucky with the allocation of the money in Kentucky being diverted to
allocation of opium settlement.
Being diverted to psychedelic
opiate
insiders and companies there at the exclusion of pre-existing mental health groups, harm reduction groups, and all that. I think that was a Daily Beast story that they did the long
I think it was.
piece on that. It was really excellent. I was not expecting this deep investigative dive into the political connections.
Million? Was that right? I'm misremembering. It was like $48 million.
It was a lot. It was something. They were going to allocate
I forget the exact amount, but it's a mess. That whole situation down there is an absolute mess. That piece, I don't. Maybe you can pull it up here. Kentucky.
Yeah, but they're going to allocate it to ibogaine research because I don't think we actually got there.
The big money. Yeah, this is the article. It came out in October. The big money behind Kentucky AG Daniel Cameron's bizarre psychedelic drug crusade. I'm gonna post that and.
Yeah, I mean, but it's really interesting, and I think one of the things that's always interested us here at Psymposia about psychedelics, among many parts of them, is that it actually becomes this really interesting lens for looking at capitalism, because we have this huge hype machine, that is directed towards the construction of an industry. Let's pull practices out of a stigmatized, subculture with sort of well-known chemicals that have their own weird history. But let's build a multi-billion-dollar industry about it. And because it's at this nascent stage, you see the very, I guess it's not at a nascent stage anymore, but you see very clearly the sort of the gears, you definitely need to create a buzz, and you're going to need to lobby people. You're going to need to get capital on board, definitely be bipartisan, spin, hopeful narratives, but don't get lost in the details, promise a lot, but be vague about it. And it'll work out. And if it doesn't, don't worry, we'll move on to something else, whether it's fusion or Microdose HQ down there in Wonderland, Florida, recently decided that our conference isn't just about psychedelics anymore. We're going to do longevity too, and it's just, here's capitalism trying to ever expand into new markets.
On that note, I recommend, if anyone hasn't seen it, Shayla Love's recent piece in The Guardian that talks about the psychedelics and longevity connection and the hype involved in that.
I got to see Shayla down there while she was covering that piece.
Oh, that's cool. She's one of my favorites. She's great.
Yeah, I was really happy that these pieces came out kind of close to each other, and just to see that the nuances being explored more. And what I really appreciated about your piece too was that you mentioned that while it's a minority of the field that is currently trying to have this more critical, nuanced conversation, it's a growing minority. And that's definitely been my impression, because our perspective on all of this has been fairly consistent for years now. And a few years ago, I think that a lot of people were resistant to having these conversations, and now we're being sought out more and more, because people feel like this is where this is where the discourse needs to be with this, as you mentioned in your piece, my talk, you can be both pro psychedelics and anti-hype. I was trying to kind of get across this. We're not prohibitionist. We can acknowledge that psychedelics are sometimes extremely beneficial to people and communities. Right. And we can still have concerns about the ways that things are. And you did such a good job with your piece, the way you set it up. And I was teaching newspaper writing in my class, around the time this came out. I had been looking for good examples of leads and organization. And then it was perfect. I love the way you did it, because you started out with the news hook of this recent event, but then you were very explicit about this, the the pro psychedelic aspect. Like, we can acknowledge that there are a lot of things to be excited about. And then you even end at the end of the piece, you kind of return back to that point that none of the experts that you spoke with for the story believe that psychedelics are inherently bad. They're simply, this is from your piece, they're simply urging caution, further research, and a realistic analysis of what the existing research shows. And then I love that you included this point that you've already touched on, but the opposite of criminalization is not medicalization, no matter what those hyping psychedelic therapy might suggest, that there are other models and that we can explore the implications of medicalization and whether or not we all want to be on this train.
Right. Thank you. That's very kind of you. And yeah, in general, I, mental health is so complex. Anyone who is proposing any kind of a silver bullet or any kind of one size fits all anything, I think deserves to be interrogated very closely, because while it may help a lot of people, nothing works for everybody. Like, you can't have something as complex as mental health and just say, okay, we've got the solution. We've got it right here. As appealing and tempting as that may be, and as good as that might make people feel, it's, the other shoe is going to drop at a certain point, and I would prefer people are prepared for that.
Yeah,
I suspect those narratives that do, the panacea, silver bullet, the hype, psychedelics for world peace. I was saying this to Nishay, I think last night, that I think that those ideas are going to become difficult to maintain in the space moving forward, because so prior to 2018, you basically had small communities, and the space generally existed of like some weirdos and the collaborations between nonprofits and universities. And then you had the flood of capital that came in the space, and it just like completely, it took some of the beliefs that were kind of strewn around, and it amped them up and made those beliefs those beliefs supported the kind of all that early, say, mind med hype and all these things, that they were conducive to getting more people in the door. And now with just a complete devastation of the companies, who are generally all down 95%, all of those people, all the speculators, they're gone. So a lot of those voices are not even in the room anymore. The money left and they followed the money out. They're now onto AI or whatever new fancy thing that they're onto, Tesla or whatever. So now I think that we've had that flush. You're going to have, the cooler heads in the space, who generally tended to be the younger people who are now, who've been here now for a cycle in this space. And, my hope is that those voices are continue to be amplified, which I think they synthesize those two extreme positions. They're in the middle somewhere in there. Like, psychedelics can be super beneficial. They can also be pretty fucked up. And let's like have a more mature, cool, I don't know, whatever environment, space.
I do want to, just before we wrap, just return to this point that Katie was making about the magic bullet kind of claims for psychedelics, because you were mentioning nothing works for everybody, and that's definitely one side of the concern with the kind of magic pill solution to problems. But another one that I just wanted to emphasize was touched on by Jeremy Lindenfeld in chat, who said, I also wonder how much psychedelic assisted therapy in situations like this, referring to previous part of the conversation, but can pacify folks into complacency with material conditions that could and should be changed. Because this gets to something that Pace and I and the rest of us we've talked about, an analogy to how pharmaceuticals enable factory farming situations where it's like it's so toxic and dangerous and so much bacteria and it's not healthy and could not exist in the way that it exists today if they weren't pumped full of antibiotics. And so, you know, there's a real risk that even if psychedelics are successful at helping, if the conditions are toxic, the environmental conditions are, if people are responding to a need for change with, you know, stress and inflammation, maybe we should change those underlying conditions and not just like get people to tolerate what would otherwise be intolerable.
Yeah.
What's interesting about that insight, which really doesn't get enough play in, you know, sort of the broader discourse, is like it was pretty much, you know, turned into, it was novelized in part in Brave New World. You know, take a Soma holiday because you live in a eugenics dystopia and sometimes it's stressful. So go space out on a mattress someplace and then come back and perform your assigned role.
Yeah.
Get back in that salt mine.
Yeah. And ultimately, just, you know, as a last point, like we have all, at least like, you know, we've come to this field because we're interested in it. Like not because we want to be spending our time putting out fires and like dealing with all of this like chaos, but ultimately I'm hoping that like eventually I can kind of get some of these things dealt with so that I can actually go and do the things that I want to do, which is like talk about trippy psychedelic literature and trip reports. And like, there's so much interesting stuff there.
And beauty.
A lot of time, and beauty and connection and wonder and awe and play and art. And it's just, it's this, you know, a lot of people who, you know, come across some of our critiques, they think we're just like very negative people, but like honestly we just want to have a good time. We just want to be able to create an environment that like we're able to not get raped by people and be screwed over.
And it's so interesting to feel like, because the hype is so strong and so what it is, that like you have to counterweight it in this way, where it's, you know, if we were all just sort of a little more eyes open, a little more free discussion, a little more inclusive of the good, the bad, and the ugly, we could get into other subjects. But it's right now, it just feels like there's such a pull to be the other voice because, you know, it's not being said enough.
Because certain guardrails are absent. And I, as a person who has had the good fortune in life to plan some pretty awesome parties here and there, you know, if you don't,
I can attest.
if you don't, you know, think very deeply and talk very frankly in the planning stages about what predictably could go wrong if you don't attend to it, if you don't anticipate it, and if you don't respond to it when it inevitably happens, it ruins the party and no one's having any fun anymore.
Well, I'm happy that you ended it on that point instead of the other point, Pace, because the other point that you previously made was pretty dismal. pretty bad way to end it.
No, man, do the chores, do the work, and then let's party.
Anybody got any final thoughts?
Where can people find you, Katie?
So I am on whatever it's called now, X, Twitter.
It's called Twitter.
Yeah,
the artist formerly known as Twitter.
Thank God. I was
like, why are we going along with the like delusional billionaire fantasy? Like, you know,
yeah. Okay. I can be found on Twitter
along, unfortunately,
at Miss MacBride, and I'm also on Blue Sky as that, and those are really the only ones I use.
We'll throw it in the chat.
Okay.
Katie, again, I want to say we all really, I appreciated your piece quite a lot. You know, as people who have often sort of criticized the things that are being put out there, it was really a breath of fresh air. So thank you so much. Thank you for coming on and talking to us about it. And you know, anybody who is watching now or comes across it, please take a look at the socials of our guest and give her a follow.
Yeah, for anyone that wants to support the show, you can support us on Patreon. It's symposia.com/Patreon. And if you're not subscribed to YouTube, do that. And yeah,
And
we're
stay
on
tuned
Twitter
for
@Psymposia.
updates because we're going to be getting
Yeah,
more,
we'll be
doing more,
changing shit
changing
up
some stuff
soon.
up. Yeah, doing more live streams, stuff like that. So thanks to everyone who's been with us, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you guys for having me. It was really fun.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming.
All right, cool.
Bye.